Tonight on Bridge City News, a new study says the neo-Nazi movement is gaining ground in our province. We will hear what Lethbridge police have to say about the issue. Former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould says Ottawa has fallen behind the times when it comes to dealing with our country's Aboriginal issues. And the Saskatchewan wildfires are now under control. We have the details.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. A new report by the Organization for the Prevention of Violence says hundreds of Albertans are linked to extremist movements. Many are now using social media to connect and promote their views. Bridge City News has received reports that people from Lethbridge have seen self-proclaimed neo-Nazis promoting their ideals online and in town. The Lethbridge Police Service is aware of the issues, but has not yet seen a spike in hate-related crimes just yet.
There is a lot online, and a lot of it comes to our attention. A lot of it, people know I'm the diversity officer, and so they might just actually reach out to me directly. We have to take each instant, every event individually, and we have to examine it to see whether or not it crossed that very fine line of hate speech or a crime of some sort. I'm actually really passionate about building bridges between different diversities. So it could be the Muslim population, it could be the Aboriginal, the Indigenous population, and trying to build bridges of understanding. And that's what I'm very passionate about.
In January, the OPV received a grant of $1.29 million from the federal government for the 3-year study on extremist movements in our province. How far have we come, and how far do we need to go when it comes to Aboriginal rights? That was the question posed by a BC professor who visited Sackpaw in Lethbridge today.
I think that they're being given kind of real respect by our courts more and more all the time. And as far as where they're going, I think we still have a long way to go. Depending on kind of what rights are being claimed and kind of where, like around land claims, So there's a lot coming that way, I think for Canada. In terms of, say, modern comprehensive land claims that are getting kind of hammered out as we speak in British Columbia, those are definitely moving forward in the path of reconciliation, for sure. And that has to do with kind of, like I say, more British Columbian comprehensive land claims around on a treaty-by-treaty basis, setting up kind of self-government, self-management of resources, education. That the governments are, at least on paper, at least on theory, are becoming more kind of equal partners, if you want to put it that way.
Nolan says since 1982, Canada's Constitution has recognized Aboriginal rights, and therefore, since Aboriginal rights are reconcilable with Canadian law, they're already part of the legal system. 2 former Liberal cabinet ministers, Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, who were kicked out of caucus, spoke to the BC First Nations Justice Council. Jody Wilson-Raybould says Ottawa has fallen back in managing the problem of First Nations.
This work moving forward also requires the basic Crown recognition of Indigenous title, rights, and governments to take place. This is something that little over a year ago I expected was going to happen imminently, following the Prime Minister's historic words in the House of Commons. As you all know, this has not occurred, and I fear we may have temporarily fallen back into a less audacious, less meaningful conversation and mode of work that, while perhaps more comfortable, will not achieve the transformative space that is required. My fear and disappointment is that despite sounding the alarm, providing advice, pushing and challenging, sharing perspectives of lived Indigenous experience, providing a lens into the reality of being Indigenous, the federal government has fallen back once again into a pattern of trying to, quote, manage the problem.
There's been some controversy involving basement apartments. Many residents are wondering why illegal suites are such a concern. Some are also wondering if their basement unit is in fact legal. BCN's Loris Alexander caught up with a local realtor to find out what makes a unit legal or illegal.
An illegal basement suite is a basement that has been developed to accommodate an extra living, and typically you will find there an extra kitchen and living space as well.
Edwin says an illegal basement does not have the required permit for proper development.
An illegal basement does not have the proper municipality bylaws attached to it, so somebody didn't go and request proper permitting for it to be allowed to have the proper development.
There are a few serious concerns surrounding illegal basements that literally make the difference between life and death.
So some of the hazards could be that they may not be able to get out if there was an emergency, so the windows may not be big enough. They would not meet what's called egress. Another one could be that if there isn't fire alarms that are attached to the whole house, they may not hear that there is a fire going on, and subsequently somebody can die from carbon monoxide, may not be able to get out because there might be obstructions as well. So these are kind of more of the serious things that can happen in an illegal suite because they do not meet the standard that it should.
Edwin says talk to Development Services at the City of Lethbridge and they will advise you of the requirements. For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
Spring usually comes with better driving conditions, and with that, you usually see more cyclists on the road. Lethbridge Police want to remind drivers to be aware of others who share the roadways.
Look forward, look behind you, look to both sides, especially at intersections as well. Bicyclists need to pay attention to road conditions. If there is gravel on the road still, that's something that they need to be mindful of, as well as other vehicles, because it has been a long winter and our people who are driving our vehicles are potentially not thinking about the fact that cyclists may be out on the roads. So as a cyclist, you need to be mindful of the traffic around you and the conditions of the environment. For provincial law, anyone under the age of 18 has to wear a approved helmet anytime they're riding a bike or if they're a passenger on a bike. So even their little ones that are in a tow-behind carrier, they need to be wearing a helmet as well.
Some of the safest and more picturesque bike trails in our region can be found online at mapmyride.com. It might taste like meat and have the consistency of a fresh hamburger, but the Beyond Meat burger is plant-based. A&W has successfully sold thousands of these burgers, and now the widely popular product will be available in 3,000 Canadian grocery stores starting on May 1st. Alberta is known for the beef producers, but the vegan community in Lethbridge would like to have more options when it comes to mealtime.
I wish there were more vegan options in Lethbridge. It's hard going out with friends because it always turns into, you know, Solly, where do you want to eat? And I'm like, I'll go wherever you guys want. And they're like, but what if they don't have vegan options? And then I got to be like, I'll have a plate of fries. But is a plate of fries really all you want to eat? You know, I like going to Mango Tree because they have chana masala and lots of chickpeas and like a full meal. And you know, you can't find a full meal in a lot of places here if you're a vegan. Or at least not without a lot of modifications and a lot of talk with the waiter and making sure that they know what is vegan in the first place.
The Beyond Meat burger will be available at local grocery stores including IGA, Loblaws, and Save On Foods. Repairing your garden after winter can take time and effort. Experts say, however, consistency is the key to keeping your blooms fresh and full year after year.
First biggest basic, we're going to talk about perennials because they can take cooler weather. They can go out sooner than the long weekend in May. And the nice thing about perennials, they're the plants that die down for the winter, but the root stays alive and they come back the following year. So they get larger, they get fuller. There's such a great selection of them that you can go from little tiny plants that are only 2 or 3 inches off the ground, flowering, right up to great big 6-foot plants that sometimes flower later on the summer, but every perennial has a different name and they have different color combinations. So it makes for a lot of fun figuring out what will grow. They can grow in shade, part shade, full hot sun, and we even have almost what you call desert type plants. So it's a beautiful thing to be able to do. And perennials really help combine well in a garden if you want to put a little bit of flowers out for all the time flowering, like an annual petunia or marigold. The perennial gives you your basic and it gives you your stability to plant in there.
Barbie says perennials can be planted as soon as the ground is workable. She says each variety has a unique blooming period that lasts several weeks, so choose plants with different bloom times to ensure continuous color. We just had an election in Alberta with more than 70% of Albertans taking part. It's safe to say that we were engaged. What about students, and more specifically, students of faith-based schools? How actively involved are they in our community? Ray Pennings is with the think tank Cardis in Ottawa, and he says for the most part, Christian kids are very involved.
So on a whole range of measures, what we found is they were more, especially on the civic side, not on every measure necessarily. Ironically, they tend to vote a little less in some jurisdictions, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. They protest a little less and on different things. But when we take the total cumulative engagement and involvement, graduates of faith-based schools are equal or greater involved than graduates of public schools.
Catch my full interview with Mr. Pennings discussing the challenges Christian kids face in a secular world coming up in the second half of our show. The Speaker of the Alberta Legislature is advising the province's 47 new politicians to use social media at their own peril. Bob Weiner offered up the advice to those elected for the first time who gathered for an orientation session at the legislature. He told the newbies to pause before hitting the send button if their grandmothers would not like to be reading their comments on the front page of the newspaper the next day. He told the newbie politicians to be prepared not to eat well, to miss hockey games, graduations, and birthdays after the UCP is sworn in and the legislature resumes sitting in late May. Last October, the federal government legalized recreational use marijuana in our country. Now, BC's provincial health officer is urging the province to decriminalize the possession of drugs to fight an overdose crisis that has already killed thousands. Bonnie Henry says decriminalization would protect people from highly toxic street drugs and would allow police to help those living with addictions to receive the support they need.
What we're talking about is alternative pathways for people who are caught with substances with small amounts for their own use, and that can vary depending on the situation, where there are alternatives to incarceration. There are alternatives to criminal charges for people. So this could be administrative charges, this could be connection with social services, with public health, with health services and harm reduction services. There are many different pathways that we can use that are alternatives to incarceration and criminal charges.
The Saskatchewan Fire Commissioner says the 2 wildfires burning in west central Saskatchewan are now under control. Dwayne McKay says a wildfire burning near the town of Biggar is no longer a threat. The fire forced the evacuation of dozens of patients from the Biggar Health Centre to other centres in Rosetown and Saskatoon. With extremely dry conditions, fire officials are asking residents across Saskatchewan to not have any open fires. A separate wildfire near North Battleford wiped out a home on the Sweetgrass First Nation. Police say a reported anti-Semitic attack at a Winnipeg cafe last week was not a hate crime, but was staged by the owners. They began investigating after receiving a report that Burmax Cafe and Bistro had been spray painted with swastikas and a woman working there had been assaulted. Chief Danny Smith says the 3 owners of the cafe, including the woman who was reportedly assaulted, have been charged with public mischief after police say the incident was faked. Smith says he cannot talk about a motive, but the use of hate and racism trivializes genuine victims of hate. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau visited Gatineau, Quebec after heavy rain and the spring melt flooded many parts of the city. The Canadian Armed Forces were also working on flood prevention in the area.
We're here noticing and noting how the floods across the country are a challenge here in Quebec and elsewhere. We need to make sure that we're continuing to work well, all orders of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, as we are, to ensure that we're keeping people safe and supporting them through these difficult moments. But at the same time, we also have to reflect that with climate change, we're going to see more and more of these extreme weather events more regularly. It means we have to think about adaptation and mitigation and how we're going to move forward together. I also want to thank the members of the Canadian Armed Forces who are here, who are doing work to try and prevent the worst of the damage. This is something that obviously we're going to be dealing with right now and for time to come.
Homes in Rigaud, Quebec sit in the water during spring flooding. One resident says many people have lived in the area for years and they refuse to move despite the flooding.
We've been here 21 years. Most people have been here for like a longer time than us. And there's this, one of my neighbor was saying there's like a dollar value to our house, but there's also the emotional value. I think that we could do collective intelligence and come up with like good solutions, because this is a situation that will happen time and again. We have to think long term, I think. Right now, very few people are still in their houses because we want to protect our houses. So for example, with us, we have 5 pumps going on full time, electrical pumps, and we have one gas pump that we installed 2 days ago, and it's going on, on a constant basis. But of course, you need to feed the gas pump with gas. So therefore, that's the reason why we're staying here, because we want to protect what we have.
Hours after former U.S. President Joe Biden launched his presidential bid, he spoke with reporters after arriving at a train station in North Carolina.
If you are the best choice for the Democrats in 2020, why didn't President Obama endorse you?
I asked President Obama not to endorse, and he doesn't want to. Whoever wins this nomination should win it on their own merits.
Sir, why you?
Welcome to Delaware.
You and your message very clearly made this about a debate about President Trump, but you're going to have to get through the Democratic primary first. Why are you the best choice for Democrats?
That'll be for the Democrats to decide.
Pregnant women guide their own care in group prenatal visits, and doctors are taking notice. As we hear now this next report, it is a low-tech approach involving 2-hour sessions grouping women at the same stage of pregnancy.
In an unusual kind of medical visit, women do their own blood pressure checks, get their growing bellies measured, and share questions on cramps, cravings, and car seats. Partners are invited, but moms-to-be take center stage. Group prenatal visits help them take charge of their own pregnancy care.
It's pretty much patient-led, so even though the nurse and I will facilitate the conversation, a lot of the patients will begin to talk about solutions, things that work for them, comfort relief, comfort measures, that sort of thing.
The informal visits emphasize things like healthy eating, managing anxiety and stress, plus labor and delivery issues. The low-key approach is hardly high-tech, but the benefits go beyond camaraderie. Some studies show they include fewer preterm births and more breastfeeding. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recently endorsed group visits as a promising alternative to traditional prenatal care.
We are really interested in understanding how it is that improvements in social support, reductions in psychosocial stress may actually change women's physiology during pregnancy and may lead to improved birth outcomes.
Only about 3% of U.S. women receive group prenatal care. It typically starts with monthly 2-hour visits and more frequent meetings later on. Kaylee Morel Alvarez says she was sold after her first visit.
I was really scared, like, what if something happens? That's always, it happens in the early stages usually. So I was really worried about that, but it was definitely reassuring coming to the group and being able to hear all the stories from everyone.
The last session is a celebration of birth. New moms get a chance to look back on their shared journey and ahead to newly forged friendships. A bonding experience that helps mother and child.
Now, if you've been praying for moisture, your prayers may be answered. Rain mixed with snow is on the way. I'll have complete weather details coming up in just a moment. Another nice day in the Windy City with lots of sunshine. Just a few clouds tonight with a low near -1. Tomorrow, a low-pressure system arrives, bringing clouds and showers and a high near 5. Saturday, more rain with the mercury climbing to 8. Sunday, a chance of snow developing with a high of only 0. Monday, a mixture of sun and cloud and a high near 3. Tuesday, the clouds should clear out, bringing lots of sunshine and a high near 9. Pretty much the same picture on Wednesday. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 15 and an average low of +1. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1946 at 28 degrees, and the record low was -10 in 1959. Sunrise was at 6:20, sunset at 8:39. Let's see how tomorrow's shaping up across the country now. It'll be mainly sunny in Victoria with a high near 14. Just a few clouds at 14 as well in Vancouver. Periods of rain mixed with snow in Calgary and a high near 4 tomorrow. Mainly overcast and 9 for Edmonton. A mixture of sun and cloud and a high of 11 expected in Regina on Friday. Mainly cloudy and 11 as well for Saskatoon. Lots of sunshine and 12 is on tap for Winnipeg. Periods of rain and 12 for Toronto tomorrow. Rain and 13 for Ottawa. Montreal will also receive showers and should see a high near 12 degrees. In the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will have light showers and 12. Halifax, Nova Scotia will be mainly cloudy and 12. Charlottetown, PEI will have lots of cloud and 9. Expect light flurries and a high near 3 degrees in St. John's, Newfoundland tomorrow. Canadian farmers anticipate planting more wheat, corn, dry peas, and oats this year compared to last. But Stats Canada says seeding intentions for canola, soybeans, and lentils have declined. Planting intentions have been influenced by lower prices for some crops due to global supply, tariffs, and trade issues. Given the intention of farmers to plant a greater area of wheat, corn, and dry field peas, there is an expected increase in seeded area for grain, pulse, and specialty crops. Canfor has announced another cutback in production. It's due to low lumber prices and the high cost of wood supplies. The Vancouver-based company says beginning April 29th, it will reduce production output by about 100 million board feet spread across its BC mills. Canfor announced earlier cutbacks of about 40 million board feet back in January. The company announced further curtailments last fall as lumber prices declined while wood fiber costs rose. The BC forestry industry has struggled with a loss of supply because of forest fires and insect infestations. The self-employed are among the growing number of Canadians turning to private lenders after facing challenges in obtaining mortgages.
Unfortunately, the fastest growing mortgage space in Canada is the alternative and private lending space, because as guidelines become more rigid and more strict, the introduction of the stress test, reduction in the allowable amount of years of amortization that we can now secure for our clients is becoming harder and harder to qualify, and therefore more and more clients are falling from the A space down to the B space, and those that perhaps were in the B space are now falling down to the private space. Now, with that said, even in the past, before these changes came out, it was still typically more advantageous to expense as much as you could, lower that income as much as you could, therefore reducing your income tax, but you're paying a little bit more for your mortgage. You still typically came out in a more favorable position in the end. In the past, they were very rigid. You had to have this, and this in order to satisfy CMHC, especially, that individual could qualify for the mortgage. And now CMHC is saying, well, perhaps an unincorporated person may not have access to audited financial statements. So we're going to allow them to use a T1 general in combination with a notice of assessment, for example. We can gross up the income based on that.
Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. We've heard the terms, but what exactly are they exactly? Fergus Hodgson is with the Frontier Centre for Public Policy in Ottawa, and he has a pretty good handle on what cryptocurrency really is.
It's a private form of money, and it's the most pure form of money you can find because it does not have any backing. Its sole offering is a means of exchange. So when we want to trade things, we can either focus on barter, where we actually trade something directly, or we have some medium of exchange. And cryptocurrencies offer a medium of exchange, a digital token, a medium of exchange that is outside of government or outside of central banks, and it's an evolution beyond gold and silver because it has no backing. Purely its own ease of use is the selling point.
Catch my full interview with Mr. Hodgson discussing the benefits and dangers of cryptocurrency coming up after business news. Now, here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, the Saskatchewan Fire Commissioner says the two wildfires burning in west central Saskatchewan are now under control. Dwayne McKay says a wildfire burning near the town of Biggar is no longer a threat. The fire forced the evacuation of dozens of patients from the Biggar Health Centre to other centres in Rosetown and Saskatoon. With extremely dry conditions, fire officials are asking residents across Saskatchewan to not have any open fires. What exactly is cryptocurrency and how does it work? Up next, I chat with an expert on the subject who discusses the benefits and dangers of using Bitcoin. That interview is on deck. But first, here's a look at what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Do you enjoy working with kids? The Lethbridge Soccer Association is looking for coaches for the outdoor soccer season. Volunteers will be coaching youth ages 4 to 19 and will be able to pick from the available teams. No experience is necessary, but a criminal records check is required. All equipment, uniforms, schedules, and team lists are provided. For more information about this fun opportunity, call Michaela at 403-320-5425. The Watch is looking for volunteers to act as additional eyes and ears for the Lethbridge Police Service. Volunteers will provide an extra layer of safety, promote the city of Lethbridge, build relationships with businesses, and some administrative duties. Training for the Watch program will be ongoing, and volunteers will be on foot patrol working in groups. For more information and to sign up, call Sergeant Mike Williamson at 403-330-5204. Easy Does It is an Al-Anon support group for adult children of alcoholics. Get an opportunity to share about your experiences with those who understand and learn healthy coping skills for your relationships. This group meets Thursdays at 7 p.m. at the Church of the Good Shepherd. For details, call Judy at 403-329-0661. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
By now, you have probably heard of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Is it here to stay? Is it safe? Is it even beneficial? Joining me now is Fergus Hodgson. He's the Executive Director of the Latin American intelligence publication Antigua Report. He's also a research associate with the Frontier Center for Public Policy. Thanks for joining me today from Ottawa.
It's my privilege. Thank you.
Fergus, can you first of all explain to our viewers who may not be familiar with cryptocurrency, what is it exactly?
Sure. Well, it's a private form of money, and it's the most pure form of money you can find because it does not have any backing. Its sole offering is a means of exchange. So when we want to trade things, we can either focus on barter, where we actually trade something directly, or we have some medium of exchange. And cryptocurrencies offer a medium of exchange, a digital token, a medium of exchange that is outside of government or outside of central banks. And it's an evolution beyond gold and silver because it has no backing. Purely its own ease of use is the selling point.
Now, because it's a decentralized currency, are we seeing more people in less developed countries using it? It may open doors that otherwise may not be open for them?
Yes, so actually that's a great question because Canada and New Zealand, where I'm from, we have basically the best central banks in the world, along with the likes of Switzerland. So we suffer very little inflation. I mean, a couple of % per year. I mean, I would like zero, but in places like Argentina or Venezuela, where inflation is out of control, of course, people are trying to flee the regular currency. And that means, yeah, so basically right now, Buenos Aires is one of the key hubs for the adoption of cryptocurrencies. Obviously, Bitcoin was the first, and so it has the most name recognition. But there are literally hundreds competing to take up this opportunity.
You know, I'm thinking about the Zimbabwean dollar. You get 10 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. That's worth maybe 30 cents right now. So maybe they should look at a cryptocurrency as well, right?
Well, my own view is that in the long run, private currencies will beat out central banks. And the truth is, too, that central banks are not like gravity. The Canadian Central Bank only began in the 1930s. Private banks or private currencies reigned for most of human history. So central banks are really a modern development and an unstable one. The current regime has been off the gold standard since 1971. So in terms of the hyperinflation, this has happened all around the world. There is a project studying hyperinflation, the Troubled Currencies Project, based in Washington, D.C., and you can follow them. They do private assessments of inflation around the world. And like I said, Venezuela and Argentina are up there right now. I traveled to Venezuela a few years ago, and one of the jokes was that if you want to have too much money to put in your wallet, go to Venezuela, you're rich. And literally you would have $100 and you could not fit it in. Basically, it would be a briefcase full of cash.
Fergus, how susceptible is cryptocurrency to inflation or deflation?
Well, one of the key points of Bitcoin is that it is inflation proof. In other words, there is no central bank devaluing it or diluting its availability. There's a clear formula of availability which is fixed. There can be no devaluation of it. However, given the fluctuating demand, even if the supply is fixed, there's fluctuating price value of it. In the long run, of course, the average leads to increased valuation. However, there is fluctuation. With the challenge too is that we're dealing with many different cryptocurrencies in this space, and they have different designs or features or whatever it may be. And there's given the concern about fluctuating value, there is a new round of cryptocurrencies called stable coins, which have particular features that make them, as the name implies, more stable.
Fergus, I think many people have doubts about cryptocurrency because, as I understand it, it does not have any solid backing like gold. Does that present maybe some potential problems?
Yes and no. The challenge with gold is that it's obviously served as a fractional reserve, that when you actually put a gold in a warehouse and give bills out to redeem in gold, the warehousing becomes a fractional, becomes redeemable in a fractional sense. So in some ways, getting away from that's an advantage in that we don't have fractional reserves. However, there is no lock on its value. In other words, that it is not tied to anything physical, and therefore its pure selling point is its capacity to be a medium of exchange, and therefore it proves itself based upon its. For example, it's not controlled by any borders or any governments, and it's purely digital. It has advantages over the current forms of money in circulation. Is it not having a backing? It may lead people to trust it less, but even so, in the long run, my own sense is that will be an advantage.
So how difficult is it to learn how to use cryptocurrency? Would it be a bit of a challenge for seniors?
No, I don't think it's difficult at all. In fact, anyone can download an application right now and have a digital wallet right away. The truth is that it's just like driving a car. You don't need to understand how an engine works to drive a car. Not everyone needs to be a computer scientist to use cryptocurrencies. The fact is that even here in Ottawa, you will find ATMs where you can basically trade your cash for cryptocurrencies, just like we do at any ATM. So it really, what my view is that the real challenge is to adoption is the availability or use by retailers. And so the more retailers make it their mission or make it available, which I think is a great marketing technique to say, we will accept cryptocurrencies, all the users or fans of cryptocurrencies will come to your store. As that gathers steam, and it is gathering steam, then we will see more adoption more broadly. And also, as more people become online entrepreneurs who deal across borders and don't want to deal with exchange rates, then we will see more adoption, because that's one of the chief advantages, not only avoiding the government inflation, but being able to not deal with exchange rates at all, simply dealing in a digital form, direct.
So how are the governments of the world responding to this trend toward using cryptocurrency instead of federal bank cash?
Yeah, that's a great question. Many governments fear this. They realize that their monopoly or their hold on cash is weakening. And a bunch of them have outright banned it. Ecuador is one. There are about half a dozen, or it depends on how you define it, because many of them are restrictions that are a little bit opaque. But a bunch of countries have outright banned cryptocurrencies, and then some have tried to introduce their own cryptocurrencies. Ecuador is another one. They both banned it and introduced their own, which was a failure. So they recognize that it is challenging the status quo, and it's not going away. It's a rising challenge. We're still early days. First world countries like Canada, the Bank of Canada is aware of this challenge, and it's the threat to its dominance. I see it as healthy competition, to be frank. So I don't see it as a problem at all. And they have discussed having what's called a central bank digital currency. But I've written why that would be a waste of time, because what they're offering doesn't really offer any advantages over what they already have in existence. I mean, because we already have an Interact system in Canada, there's not really an advantage to that. My own view too, though, is that whether the Bank of Canada likes it or not, it is going to struggle to compete with private currencies over the long term. So over 10 to 20 years, you're going to see the Bank of Canada really have a hard time competing with private currencies, because many people do want advantage. Like I said, they want borderless currencies. They want to get away from inflation. And many people want to exist outside of what I consider to be punitive taxation. When you're paying half or more of your income in taxes, my own view is that's unacceptable. And many entrepreneurs or younger people who are averse to this are going to seek to escape that.
So how can governments effectively tax cryptocurrency, Fergus?
One of my good friends, Max Borders, actually says they cannot. That the truth is that he's written a great book, The Social Singularity, and he's explained that cryptocurrencies are basically at odds with income taxes in the long run. That because cryptocurrencies are so easily moved around geographically and don't really fit into any one jurisdiction, and because they exist outside conventional financial institutions, it's very hard to clamp down on them. Some people might get afraid that the welfare state's going to die. And again, I'm not afraid of that, to be frank. I want more checks on government, because right now in Canada, there's a huge battle over taxing carbon, which is a natural occurring substance, and it's very difficult to measure. Regardless, soon it'll be taxing plastic bags. The power of the government to tax us, in my mind, is already too great. And the limits imposed upon technology of people basically avoiding this, I see it as a healthy check. I prefer the rule of law. I would like us to maintain the rule of law, but at the same time, I want governments to know that the level of taxation we are experiencing in modern economies in the 21st century is just out of control, and they have basically brought this upon themselves. And what makes it worse, though, is that we've built an entitled class of people who expect these handouts, and I think that's the real challenge. Not the fact that people are avoiding taxes or are going to find ways to move the money offshore. It's the fact that people have feel entitled to a vast welfare state that is unsustainable.
Now, some say cryptocurrency can provide a measure of anonymity, more privacy for consumers. Does it really provide some protection from government eyes?
Oh man, that's a great question. So, yes and no. Right now, Bitcoin, the most famous, actually is not as private as, say, cash. Because right now, cash is the most private of all. You can go to a church gathering and drop cash into a collection box, and nobody knows you gave the money, right? It's basically as anonymous as you can get. And there is a movement, a bit like stable coins. There are also coins that are particularly structured or designed to protect your privacy. And that, to me, there's an advantage, and it's going to grow. So right now, the main technology, the Bitcoin, is not so private, but that was a first attempt, and the innovations will be more private. And yes, but again, privacy and money is not a new thing. Cash has been private for a long time, so I don't see there's a problem. What I see as a problem really is a surveillance state, which would track all of our financial activities. So right now, for example, whenever you use your bank account, you can be traced. And we have basically a level of surveillance, an unprecedented level of surveillance. So it would really be, to me, a return to more of a cash-based society, but in digital form. So basically a digital form of private currency.
I understand that Facebook will be releasing its own cryptocurrency, and of course the Bank of Canada planning on coming up with some kind of a digital currency. Are we going to see more and more of this?
Yes, yeah, of course we're going to, because people recognize that if they're going to create a digital currency, which creates is almost costless to produce, and people are going to pay for it to have a use for it, then of course the people are going to try to get a piece of that pie. Because basically cryptocurrencies are a new technology which is going to grow, and people are trying to get into that right now, and already the market is enormous, right? So there are more than a dozen cryptocurrencies with market capitalizations in excess of $1 billion, and there are 700 which have more than $1 million in circulation. So the market is huge, and it's only going to grow. What I do expect, though, is that there'll be a consolidation, that the 700 or so the vast majority will go to nothing. But let's say a dozen, those top few, many of them will be adopted in a wider fashion.
Now, some argue that cryptocurrency is problematic in that it can give criminals a way to launder their ill-gotten gains. How do you respond to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, you'd have to ban cash. I mean, I recognize terrorism is a problem. There are already many safety checks in place for that. So if you want to deposit more than $10,000, I'm not sure about the Canadian situation, but at least in the United States, that immediately puts up a red flag and will be reported. I assume it's the same case in Canada. So there already are checks there. I guess it depends what you fear most. Do you fear terrorists or do you fear an overarching government? And the truth is it's a straw man, because thus far terrorists have simply not used cryptocurrencies. Even though it's available, they preferred cash. So I guess it could potentially be used for that, but it has not thus far. But it has been used for new, entrepreneurial endeavors. So thus far, terrorists still prefer cash to cryptocurrency. So unless you're going to ban cash, I think you've still got the same problem.
And one of the benefits of cryptocurrency is the low transaction costs. But will that last, or will greed maybe show up again?
Yeah, so actually, another great question. The truth is that with Bitcoin, the transaction costs are high. That's one of the reasons why Bitcoin, I'm trying to think now, a year and a half ago, Bitcoin had a big rally, a big peak. And I think it got to worth $20,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. And I was back in New Zealand, and my father, who's a sheep and cattle farmer, was asking, "What is this Bitcoin?" And when my father was asking me, I realized this is probably the peak of the bubble. Right? But one of the reasons why it came back was that the cost of transactions was getting high. And so, but that just means that other coins are going to be more advanced and improve on that and lower the cost. So basically the low cost of transactions is one of the key selling points. So cryptocurrencies cannot thrive or gain market share if the cost goes up. So Bitcoin itself was just a first step, right? There have been 10 years now since Bitcoin was introduced. It laid the framework or put forward the idea, and now as I said, there are 700 others competing, and they will deliver better privacy, lower transaction costs, more stability, all these things we're looking for, and that's why I just see it as an inevitability. Yes, we are in early days, but it will come and continue to advance. I don't see any way to turn this around, whether the Bank of Canada wants to compete with it or not.
So some final thoughts about cryptocurrency. Fergus, do you think it's here to stay?
Yes, it's definitely here to stay. And as I'm doing myself, I'm devoting considerable time to understanding this. Think of it as maybe 1990 when dealing with the internet. It's still early, but I really do believe that it's basically an inevitability, or it's an ominous one. So we should basically prepare for it and accept it. Don't be afraid of it. I don't see it as anything sinister. And I'm welcoming it because I've been concerned mainly about instability generated by central banks, the inflation tax, and a monetary monopoly. I would like a more competitive market in currencies, and I would like to have a more borderless world for transactions and for commerce.
Fergus Hodgson is a research associate with the Frontier Centre for Public Policy. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Ottawa.
Thanks for your time. Thank you.
It is not uncommon to see media reports that assign a level of blame onto faith-based schools for damaging social cohesion in society. There's a culture of clash between secular and religious viewpoints. Today's guest has co-written a study on this topic. Ray Pennings is the Executive Vice President of the Christian think tank Cardis, and he joins me now from Ottawa. Rock and Ray, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Ray, some believe that faith-based schools tend to shelter their students from the real world and produce people who are intolerant of others' viewpoints. What did your study find?
Well, it's actually a series of studies that we've done over the course of the past decade in partnership with Notre Dame. And what we have done is we've looked at the adult population on 3 separate occasions in the US and 3 separate occasions in Canada. So it's actually 6 representative studies. We looked at adults 23 to 39. We had a control group that went to public school. Then we had other adults who had the majority of their K-12 education in all sorts of non-government schools. We didn't just look at faith-based schools, but for the purposes of this, including faith-based schools, especially Protestant and Catholic. And what we found is that when it comes to their adult behaviors, they tend to be more civically engaged than students from similar social economic status who went to public school.
So how did you really determine which people groups tended to clash more and which tended to be more civil?
What we did is we measured behaviors on everyone's part. So we looked at three things. We looked at spiritual outcomes, academic outcomes, as well as civic outcomes. So we asked, did you vote? Do you volunteer? We used Stats Canada's criteria of volunteering and charitable giving, so we could compare to the population as a whole. So on a whole range of measures, what we found is they were more, especially on the civic side, not on every measure necessarily. Ironically, they tend to vote a little less in some jurisdictions, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. They protest a little less and on different things. But when we take the total cumulative engagement and involvement, graduates of faith-based schools are equal or greater involved than graduates of public schools.
Well, that's interesting that you say the graduates of religious-based schools stand out when it comes to giving and volunteering. How do those attributes contribute toward a more civil, tolerant society, Ray?
Well, the very fact of giving and volunteering means you're not thinking about yourself, first of all, but you're thinking about someone else. And when you're engaged in that, it's a view, it's an activity, but it's also a view of the world. Do you look at the world as a whole and your place in it? Or do you look at yourself and everyone else in terms of how they can serve you? Two different mindsets in terms of approach to public life. And on a aggregate level, we can say with significant confidence and data to back it up that faith-based graduates have an other-mindedness which results in civic engagement and care of neighbor.
Now, recent Barna research shows that church leaders, parents, and schools are not speaking to one another enough on these matters. Our pastors and priests tend to avoid the topic of school choice, and apparently very few parents ever ask about it. Why do you think that is?
Yes, this survey, in addition to the regular surveys we did, we just partnered with Barna to do a survey of pastors, 650 pastors and priests in the United States, as well as we have a smaller survey in Canada. What we found is that for the most part, that conversation is not happening between church, home, and school conversations. In the occasions where it is, it's a delicate issue for pastors, obviously, and priests within their own congregations. There often will be a diversity of views, some kids attending public school, some a local faith-based school, homeschooling. So it's a difficult issue, but by and large, the conversation is not really happening.
Now, Protestant churches tend not to affiliate with any particular school, and apparently only about half of pastors encourage parents to check out a Christian school. Is the financial cost maybe a big reason?
There are a variety of reasons that were there. Cost was the largest single factor that was identified. Sometimes there were concerns about the local school or the quality of it. In some occasions, that was a factor. And in other factors, there was also a sense that encouraging kids to go to public school was a way also of exercising your faith and communicating and participating in the neighborhood around you.
Now, you talk about how pastors face pressure on social issues. They will be criticized if they do speak out on them, or also criticized if they don't speak out. So it's a non-win situation. How do they handle this?
It's a difficult matter, but certainly, and it will vary based on your own religious traditions and theological principles. But for most, it's an imperative. If they're going to be faithful to their own convictions, they are going to be required, so to speak, to address these issues. I think there is a growing recognition that parishioners live in a pluralistic society. And it's not only having a position on these issues, but learning how to communicate these positions with people who disagree with you in civil and constructive ways so that society can flourish.
Now, your paper points out that a healthy society is not only a matter of getting systems, laws, and policies right, it also requires attention to the formation of citizens with the proper habits and virtues for civic life. How important is it to choose the right school for our kids?
Well, education is holistic education. That's one of the reasons why our study, somewhat distinct from many other studies that look at education, did not just look at academic achievement. We just didn't count how many how many kids went to university and what sort of universities they did. We also looked at civic engagement, which we've already touched on, the volunteering, giving, participating in society, voting. We also talked on spiritual formation. And there is a sense in which education is for life. It's not just for work, it's not just for church, it's for life as a whole. And I think it's important that we measure the outcomes of education, also looking at all of the effects.
So Ray, let me ask you something. What are your thoughts on religion becoming more aligned or affiliated with political parties? Is that maybe a dangerous path to go down?
It is, although when you look at it, we've collected data over a decade now, and I would think the mainstream myth that, Christians are in a particular party or are politically aligned, when we actually we see diversity of voting patterns. You have Christians on the left and on the right. Those who get involved sometimes tend to be passionate in terms of their involvement, and that's probably as much the nature of politics. Politicals, whether religious or not, tend to be pretty partisan and passionate sorts. But certainly, I don't think you can take a look at the overall outcomes of religion, religious schools, and say there's a schooling effect which direct towards one party or the other. That's more a consequence of social economic status and family background than it is of schooling.
So how can Christian believers bring their convictions into public life while fully respecting the rights of others in a pluralistic society?
I would say that the very first thing as a Christian, my responsibility is to see the imago Dei, the image of God in everyone, including the person I most passionately disagree with politically. I think when I begin to see my political opponent as a fellow image bearer of God, now all of a sudden that frames the nature of my conversation with him or her. Then secondly, I think you can realize the fact that we can disagree without being disagreeable. We can hold to positions and we can argue that based on data, based on material that's available to all of the public, and have robust arguments. Such it has always been in societies, and I suppose it will always be that way. But I would suggest that if we approach it by seeing the image of God and do it with a tone of hospitality, respect, we'll have something that looks quite different than Twitter today.
So how can we avoid the almost inevitable name-calling and put-downs when people disagree over, like, abortion, religion, and LGBTQ2+ issues?
Again, I would go back to what I just said in terms of the image of God. If I see the person I'm dealing with as a fellow image bearer of God, I am going to have a respect for that person, even if they live a lifestyle I totally disagree with. And if they in turn would see me in the similar sort of way, well, now we have a different sort of conversation, sort of name calling, and the two groups going into their own ghettos, which unfortunately is too much part of life today.
Let me ask you something too. I've talked to certain professors at universities who disagree with some of the ideologies that are being preached and pushed on students at these universities, but they still have to kind of fit in with the norm there. So how can we get back as a society to a place where it's actually acceptable to agree to disagree and still get along,
Well, I think sometimes we think that if we only, all went to the mushy middle and found the things that we have in common, that somehow is the answer. I actually take quite a different point of view. I think it is important for us to be able to articulate what it is, our most deeply held convictions, articulate them into the public square, but find a way that does so respectfully and engages in an affirmation of the other person that they too have deeply held convictions. And it's in the dialogue that actually I think we will learn to respect and grow with each other. It's in the discussion of difference rather than the avoidance of difference.
And we have to understand, really understand where the other person is coming from, their background, where they grew up.
And taking, I would challenge, we live in a Christian society or a pluralistic society. I would challenge Christians along the way, rather than, segregating or coming to conclusions about people who are different than themselves, learning to understand. What do we know about Islam? What do we know about Sikhism? Do you know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite and a Wahhabi? Just as we would expect them to know the differences between a Catholic and a Protestant and the various stripes within. And we recognize that there are some behaviors or beliefs that are more predictable in some groups than others. I think we need to become far more nuanced in understanding and appreciating our neighbor.
Now, you've often talked about spaces of grace when it comes to churches. What do you mean by that?
Well, when I think of religion, I think of three components to religion. There's an affirmation of a set of beliefs which are core to the faith. And as a Christian, for me, obviously the Bible and the teachings of the Bible are fundamental to that. There are a set of religious practices. I pray, I read the Bible, I attend worship, I participate in communion. And then there are behaviors that are out there in the public square as well. My love of neighbor, my giving, my approach to work as vocation. All of my life is religious, not just when I'm in church. I think church communities need to understand equipping people for living all of life according to their faith commitments. And I also think we need to be generous and hospitable, recognizing that, we confess we're all sinners. We need to be a place where sinners are welcome, where they're not judged, where they're welcome, where they're engaged with, but yes, where we affirm the truth of God's word, which doesn't mean we're automatically going to agree with every opinion or every lifestyle.
I guess, Ray, it really boils down to loving thy neighbor, but what if you have a neighbor that's not really that lovable?
Well, I would look at, I think all of us in that sense, when we see the unlovable neighbor, probably need to hold up the mirror. And the scripture says that when we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So for those who confess the name of Christ, we weren't all that lovable either, and he loved us.
And what's that expression again when you're pointing at someone else? You got one finger pointing at them, three fingers pointing right back at you, right? Ray Pennings is the Executive Vice President of the Christian think tank Cardis. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.